Did you know that Japan is officially made up of over 14,000 islands, 10 times more than most people would ever guess? Or that there's a forest at the base of its most famous mountain where compasses stop working properly? How about the fact that an entire abandoned island sat erased from Japanese maps for decades, on purpose? Well, there's a lot more to Japan than cherry blossoms and bullet trains. This is one of the strangest, most geologically violent countries on the planet. And we've got 50 facts to prove it. Let's get into it. Fact 50. Japan isn't really 4 islands, it's 14,000. Most people picture Japan as Honshu, Hokkaido, Kyushu, and Shikoku and call it a day. In reality, a 2023 government recount using updated digital mapping more than doubled the country's official island count from under 7,000 to over 14,000. The other 14,120 or so are classified simply as remote islands, scattered across a stretch of ocean more than 3,000 kilometers long. Most are uninhabited, some are barely above the waterline, and a handful are still actively growing. Japan isn't a country with some islands, it's a country made almost entirely of them. Fact 49. The whole nation sits on top of 4 collapsing tectonic plates. Japan exists because the Pacific, Philippine Sea, Eurasian, and North American plates all meet in roughly the same neighborhood, with the Pacific plate sliding directly underneath the others. That collision is the reason the country gets hit by more than 1,000 earthquakes every single year, most too small to notice. But the underlying mechanism never stops. It's also the reason Japan has around 110 active volcanoes, close to 1/10 of the entire planet's total, crammed into a country smaller than California. Fact 48. Almost 3/4 of the country is unlivable mountain. Roughly 73% of Japan's land area is mountains or forest, which sounds impressive until you realize what it means for everyone living there. Only about 15 to 20% of the country has ever been usable for farming or building cities, which is why the population gets crushed into a narrow coastal strip running from Tokyo down to Fukuoka. Step outside that strip and you're often in genuine wilderness within an hour's drive, something most people don't associate with one of the most densely packed nations on Earth. Fact 47. Mount Fuji sits exactly where 3 tectonic plates collide. Japan's most photographed mountain isn't just symbolically important, it's geologically extreme. Mount Fuji sits directly on a triple junction where the Eurasian, North American, and Philippine sea plates all meet, which is part of why it formed as a nearly perfect volcanic cone in the first place. The mountain last erupted in 1707, and the eruption was powerful enough to drop volcanic ash on Tokyo, more than 100 kilometers away, without a single drop of lava reaching the city. Fact 46. There's permafrost frozen into the side of an active volcano. You'd assume permafrost only exists somewhere like Siberia, but researchers have confirmed it exists year-round on the upper slopes of Mount Fuji itself, alongside several other Japanese peaks. It sits there quietly, buried under loose volcanic rock, completely invisible from any hiking trail. A frozen layer hiding inside one of the most climbed mountains on the planet. Fact 45. A brand new island grew out of the ocean in real time. In November 2013, a volcanic eruption south of Tokyo pushed a brand new island straight up out of the Pacific. Within weeks, it merged with the existing island of Nishinoshima, and the combined landmass kept growing for years afterward, repeatedly reshaping its own coastline with fresh lava. Japanese officials publicly joked they'd be happy to claim the new territory if it stuck around. Most of it has. Fact 44. A single uninhabited island disappeared its entire population twice. Torishima, a nearly circular volcanic island far south of Tokyo, sits on top of a submarine volcano roughly 3,000 meters tall with only the very tip poking above the waterline. A 1902 eruption killed all 125 residents living there at the time. The island was resettled, and then a second eruption in 1939 wiped it out again. Nobody has lived there since. Fact 43. The country is currently shaking through a swarm nobody fully understands. In 2025, the remote Takara Islands in southern Japan experienced an earthquake swarm with more than 2,000 individual tremors recorded in a single stretch. An unusually intense cluster even for one of the most seismically active nations on Earth. The region sits near the edge of a caldera that produced a super eruption roughly 7,300 years ago. Officials have repeatedly denied any link to a coming catastrophe, but the sheer number of tremors shows just how restless the ground underneath Japan really is. Fact 42. There's a stretch of coastline so narrow no part of the country escapes the sea. Despite its size, no location anywhere in Japan sits more than 150 kilometers from the ocean. The entire archipelago is essentially a long, narrow spine of mountains with the sea pressing in from almost every direction, which is part of why coastal flooding, tsunamis, and typhoons have shaped Japanese architecture and city planning for centuries. Fact 41. An underwater current quietly built one of the richest fishing grounds on the planet. Where the warm Kuroshio current collides with the cold Oyashio current off Japan's eastern coast, the result is one of the most productive marine ecosystems anywhere in the world. The temperature clash forces nutrients up from deeper water, feeding everything from sardines to whales, and it's a major reason seafood became such a central part of Japanese life in the first place. Fact 40. One island is currently administered from a city it's nowhere near. Torishima, despite sitting hundreds of kilometers from central Tokyo, is officially under the direct jurisdiction of the Tokyo Metropolitan Government, rather than any nearby prefecture. It has no town affiliation, no neighbors, nothing nearby except open ocean and the volcano underneath it. And yet, on paper, it's treated as part of the same administrative unit as one of the densest cities on Earth. Fact 39. The western coast and the eastern coast experience almost opposite winters. Mountain ranges running down the spine of Honshu create a dramatic weather split. Winter storms rolling in from Siberia dump enormous amounts of snow on the western, Sea of Japan side of the mountains, while the eastern Pacific side often stays dry under the same storm system. Stand on one side of the mountains in January, and you could be buried in snow, drive 2 hours, and find clear skies. Fact 38. There's a sea so enclosed it barely has tides. The Sea of Japan is almost completely sealed off from the open Pacific, connected only by a couple of narrow straits, which means very little water flows in or out. That isolation gives it unusually weak tidal movement for a body of water its size, but it also means whatever lives there tends to stay there, creating a strange, self-contained ecosystem with thousands of species packed into a relatively closed loop. Fact 37. An entire island chain stretches almost to Taiwan. Japan's southern Ensei Shoto chain runs from Kyushu all the way down to within about 110 kilometers of Taiwan, putting the country's subtropical southern tip closer to another nation entirely than to most of its own territory. The climate down there barely resembles the snowy mountains of Hokkaido at all, despite technically being part of the same country. Fact 36. The country was sealed shut from the rest of the world for over 200 years. Starting in 1635, Japan's ruling shogunate closed the entire archipelago to foreigners and banned its own citizens from traveling abroad, a policy that lasted for more than 2 centuries. That isolation didn't just shape politics. It shaped geography too, since entire coastal regions developed almost no contact with outside trade routes for generations, leaving distinct regional cultures that still show up clearly on a map today. Fact 35. There's a cave system frozen solid year-round at the base of a volcano. Around the western edge of one of Japan's most famous forests sit several lava caves carved out by Mount Fuji's last major eruption, including one known as the Fugaku Wind Cave, where ice forms naturally and survives through every season, even the height of summer. The temperature drop walking into these caves is immediate and dramatic, a frozen pocket sealed inside rock that was molten less than 1,000 years ago. Fact 34. A forest grew directly on top of solidified lava, and nowhere else looks like it. That same forest, Aokigahara, covering roughly 30 square kilometers at the base of Mount Fuji, grew entirely on top of hardened lava from the 864 CE eruption. The rock underneath is so dense that tree roots can't dig down properly, forcing them to twist and tangle above ground instead, creating a tangled, alien-looking canopy that looks nothing like a typical Japanese forest. Fact 33. That same forest can mess with your compass. The volcanic rock underneath Aokigahara carries enough natural magnetism that a compass placed directly on the ground can swing away from true north, locking onto the rock's own magnetic field instead of the planet's. Held at normal height, it behaves fine, but set it down and the readings can drift. One more reason the forest has built such a strange reputation over the decades. Fact 32. The same lava rock swallows sound itself. The porous volcanic ground beneath Aokigahara absorbs noise in a way few other forests do, creating an unusual, almost total silence even in daylight. Visitors regularly describe barely hearing birds or wind, just dense, padded quiet pressing in from every direction. The kind of silence that feels deliberate even though it's pure geology. Fact 31. Japan's military once trained navigation skills inside this exact forest. Because the dense canopy, magnetic disruption, and lack of clear landmarks make it genuinely difficult to navigate, Japan's ground self-defense force has used Aokigahara for ranger training exercises since the 1950s, deliberately testing soldiers' ability to find their way through one of the most disorienting natural environments in the country. Fact 30. An entire factory island was wiped off the map on purpose. In the 1920s, the Japanese military built a secret chemical weapons facility on a small island called Okunoshima in the Seto Inland Sea, and went to extraordinary lengths to hide it. The island was physically removed from published maps. Ferries passing nearby had to close their window shutters, and military police patrolled to make sure nobody got close enough to see what was happening. Fact 29. That erased island is now overrun by thousands of rabbits. After the war, the chemical plant was decommissioned and the island redeveloped as a public park. Rabbits were eventually released there, and with almost no natural predators, their population exploded into the thousands. Today, Okunoshima is nicknamed Rabbit Island, a strange, sunny tourist attraction sitting directly on top of the ruins of a once secret chemical weapons program. With crumbling bunkers still scattered across the same ground, the rabbits now hop across freely. Fact 28. A coal mining island once had the highest population density on Earth. Off the coast of Nagasaki sits Hashima, nicknamed Gunkanjima or Battleship Island for its jagged, fortress-like silhouette. At its 1959 peak, it packed more than 5,000 residents onto barely 6 hectares of land, a density nearly 7 times that of central Paris, with apartment buildings stacked so tightly the streets felt like narrow concrete canyons. Fact 27. That entire island city was abandoned within months. When energy needs shifted away from coal in the early 1970s, the mine shut down and Hashima was evacuated almost overnight. Buildings were left exactly as they were. Furniture, schoolwork, personal belongings included, and the island sat completely sealed off to outsiders for the next 35 years, while nature slowly reclaimed it. Fact 26. Japan has thousands of islands nobody has ever lived on at all. Of the more than 14,000 islands now officially counted, only a few hundred have ever been permanently inhabited. The rest range from barely there rock outcroppings to genuinely substantial landmasses that simply never had enough fresh water, flat ground, or strategic reason to support a settlement, leaving most of the country's island territory as empty, undocumented wilderness. Fact 25. Japan's biggest island has a coastline shaped almost entirely by violence. Honshu's coast is repeatedly battered by typhoons during late summer, the Pacific equivalent of hurricanes, and the resulting storm surge has carved cliffs, reshaped beaches, and forced entire coastal towns to rebuild their seawalls again and again. The shoreline you see on a modern map is really just this year's version of a coastline that gets rewritten almost annually. Fact 24. Ancient land bridges once connected Japan directly to the mainland. During the last ice age, sea levels dropped low enough that strips of dry land connected the Japanese islands to both Siberia and the Korean peninsula. The earliest people to reach Japan, more than 30,000 years ago, simply walked across before rising seas eventually closed those land bridges and turned the country into the isolated archipelago it's been ever since. Fact 23. One entire mountain range sits at the convergence of 3 island arcs. Mount Fuji isn't just near 3 tectonic plates, it's also positioned where 3 separate volcanic island arcs intersect: the southwestern Japan arc, the northeastern Japan arc, and the Izubonin Mariana arc. It's an unusually crowded piece of geology for a single mountain to be sitting on top of, and it's part of why the surrounding region still produces frequent volcanic and seismic activity today. Fact 22. A 1991 eruption sent ash flowing downhill faster than a car on a highway. When Mount Unzen on Kyushu reactivated after roughly 200 years of dormancy, repeated collapses of its growing lava dome generated pyroclastic flows, fast-moving walls of hot ash and gas that reached speeds up to 200 kilometers per hour racing down the mountainside. It remains one of the most dramatic volcanic events in the country's recent history. Fact 21. Japan's worst volcanic disaster killed more people than almost any natural event in its history. Centuries earlier, Unzen's 1792 eruption triggered a massive landslide and tsunami that killed more than 15,000 people, making it the deadliest volcanic disaster in recorded Japanese history. The same mountain that nearly repeated the disaster in 1991 had already proven 2 centuries earlier exactly how violent it could be. Fact 20. An island in Hokkaido grew straight into the mainland during an eruption. In 1914, the Sakurajima volcano in southern Japan erupted with such force that the resulting lava flow physically connected what had previously been an island to the mainland coastline, permanently fusing the two together. What used to require a boat to reach now just requires a short walk. Fact 19. The country's tallest peaks are split across 4 separate ranges. 3 major mountain chains, the Haida, Kiso, and Akaishi ranges, often nicknamed the Japanese Alps, cut through central Honshu with peaks regularly topping 3,000 meters. A 4th range up north, the Daisetsu Mountains of Hokkaido, holds its own ecosystem of alpine plants and animals that barely overlap with anything found further south. Fact 18. Hokkaido's permafrost is melting fast enough that scientists are racing to track it. Researchers studying the Daisetsu Mountains have confirmed permafrost exists there too, alongside Fuji and several other peaks. But climate modeling suggests that under current warming trends, large portions of it could vanish within decades. It's a slow-motion disappearance happening underground, almost impossible to observe directly, in one of the snowiest regions of the entire country. Fact 17. A single Hokkaido peninsula is Japan's most remote UNESCO site. The Shire-Toko Peninsula in northeastern Hokkaido is so isolated that it remains largely untouched by development, home to brown bears, waterfalls, and volcanic peaks, with drift ice from the Sea of Okhotsk reaching its shores every winter. It's considered Japan's most remote World Heritage location, and getting there still requires real effort even today. Fact 16. An island south of Tokyo holds 3,000-year-old trees. Nobody can date precisely. Yakushima, off the southern coast of Kyushu, is famous for its ancient Yakusugi cedar trees, some estimated to be more than 3,000 years old, growing inside a dense, moss-covered rainforest that inspired the setting of a major Studio Ghibli film. The trees are old enough that some were already centuries old by the time recorded Japanese history even began. Fact 15. Japan's deepest mining tunnels chase neutrinos instead of coal. Deep inside a mountain near the old Kamioka mine, scientists built massive underground detector facilities specifically because the surrounding rock blocks out cosmic background radiation almost completely, making it one of the best places on the planet to study subatomic particles, called neutrinos. The same geology that once drove mining operations now drives some of the most advanced physics research on Earth. Fact 14. A single sand dune system looks completely out of place. The Tottori sand dunes along Japan's western coast stretch for kilometers. A genuine desert-style landscape sitting directly against a green, mountainous country better known for forest and rice paddies than shifting sand. They form from sediment carried down by a nearby river and shaped over centuries by coastal wind. Fact 13. An entire pilgrimage route loops around one whole island. Shikoku, the smallest of Japan's 4 main islands, is home to an 88-temple pilgrimage route that winds its way around the island's entire coastline and interior. Walking the full circuit traditionally takes around 6 weeks, turning the island's geography itself into a centuries-old spiritual journey that still draws thousands of walkers every year. Fact 12. Japan's exclusive economic zone is bigger than most people realize. Despite its modest land area, Japan controls the 8th largest exclusive economic zone on the planet, an enormous stretch of ocean territory built almost entirely from its scattered island chains. Every tiny, uninhabited rock counts toward extending that boundary further out to sea, which is part of why some of these islands matter far more strategically than their size would suggest. Fact 11. One tiny reef island is barely above water and still claimed as territory. Okinotorishima. Technically, Japan's southernmost point consists of little more than a few rocky outcroppings barely poking above the waves at high tide. The government has spent enormous resources reinforcing it with concrete to keep it from disappearing entirely, since losing the rock would shrink the country's maritime claims by a massive stretch of surrounding ocean. Fact 10. The seafloor near Japan drops into some of the deepest trenches on the planet. Along Japan's eastern and southern edges, the Pacific Plate doesn't just slide underneath the country, it plunges downward into deep ocean trenches that rank among the deepest points on Earth. That descent is directly responsible for some of the most powerful earthquakes the country experiences, generated not on land but miles beneath the surrounding ocean. Fact 9. Typhoon season and earthquake season can overlap without warning. Late summer brings both peak typhoon activity and no break whatsoever from the country's ongoing seismic risk, meaning Japan can face compounding natural disasters within the same week. Emergency planning across the country has been built around this overlap for generations, since neither hazard waits politely for the other to finish. Fact 8. An entire historic capital sits inside a bowl-shaped valley. Kyoto's location, inside a mountain-ringed basin, shaped centuries of its development, trapping summer humidity and winter cold in ways that push the city's architecture and gardens toward designs specifically meant to manage that trapped air. The same valley that protected the old capital from certain invasions also baked it every summer. Fact 7. Hot springs cover the country because of the same volcanoes that threaten it. Japan's roughly 110 active volcanoes are dangerous, but they're also the reason the country has thousands of natural hot spring onsens scattered across nearly every region. The same geothermal activity that produces eruptions also heats underground water for bathing traditions that go back centuries, a strange trade where volcanic risk doubles as cultural backbone. Fact 6. The Kanto Plain is the only major flatland most of the population can actually live on. Tokyo and its surrounding region sit on the Kanto Plain, Japan's largest contiguous flat area, which is part of why such an enormous share of the country's population is crammed into one relatively small stretch of land. Step outside that plain in most directions and the terrain turns mountainous fast. Fact 5. This is the part where cursed comes in. Tucked at the base of Mount Fuji, inside that same dense lava forest mentioned earlier, Aokigahara, sits a stretch of land that's developed one of the most unsettling reputations in the entire country. Local folklore describes it as a place where yurei, vengeful spirits of the dead, are said to linger among the trees. The forest has marked sections specifically labeled as forbidden, complete with warning signage and patrols, areas tourists are explicitly told not to enter. Some locals refuse to set foot inside at all, treating the entire forest as genuinely cursed ground rather than just an eerie hike. Fact 4. The forest's reputation was shaped just as much by a novel as by nature. A 1960s Japanese novel set partly inside Aokigahara helped cement its unsettling reputation in the public imagination, and decades of films, books, and documentaries followed, repeating and amplifying the same legend until the forest's cursed reputation became almost as famous internationally as Mount Fuji itself. Fact 3. There's a town that vanished after one volcanic blast and never came back. Far south of Tokyo, the same eruption that wiped out Torishima's population not once but twice has left the island permanently uninhabited to this day, abandoned territory left entirely to seabirds and the occasional research outpost, a literal ghost island still technically under Japanese jurisdiction despite having no residents at all. Fact 2. Japan's most famous abandoned ruin still has belongings sitting exactly where they were left. On Hashima, the densely packed mining island abandoned in the 1970s, urban explorers and approved tour groups have documented apartments where furniture, old appliances, and personal items remained frozen in place untouched for decades, an entire fortress city left to crumble in real time with almost nothing removed. Fact 1. The land itself never actually stops moving. After everything, here's the biggest fact of all. Japan is never finished settling. Every year brings more than 1,000 earthquakes, slow tectonic shifts redraw coastlines, volcanic islands rise and occasionally vanish back into the sea, and entire mountainsides quietly hold permafrost that's already disappearing. Japan might look like a fixed, ancient landscape on a map, but it's actually one of the most geologically restless countries on the planet, rebuilding itself one tremor at a time. But did you know that China is hiding something nobody talks about?